Welcome, Rabbi Ari Kahn. Welcome back to the Gush. It's been a while.
Absolute pleasure.
Welcome back to this mountain that meant so much to so many of us years later. One of the experiences which was revolutionary on this mountain with Rav Lichtenstein, Rav Amital, and everyone else who assembled here was learning to see Tanakh, Parshas HaShavua, Torah at a macro level. Much of Chazal were deconstructionists, breaking down the extra word, the double language, the extra pasuk, the extra phrase. We were taught to read entire large texts and to draw important messages and to try to hitch them to reality. Well, you've certainly excelled in that, putting out the very, very world-famous Svarim, primarily in Chumash, explorations and echoes of Eden. So we're here to talk about Shemos. What about Parsha Shemos that you've thought about came from this Beis Medrash?
Well, the very thought that we look at it as a book, and again, you say macro. So one of the first things that I would think about is this book as comparing to the previous book, which actually makes you look at it in two ways. In one way you would look at it would be as a continuation, which means the unbelievable drama that we end Sefer Bereshit with. And Yosef actually dies at the end of the book, and he dies again in the beginning of this book. I guess somebody didn't like him that much, so they had to kill him off twice. But then also comparing it to the beginning of the book as a whole separate Sefer, as a whole separate idea. So just for example, when we look at the beginning of Bereshit, or for that matter, the whole book, it's a book where brothers don't get along. It's a book where there is so much dysfunctionality in the family between brothers. And then you start this book, and if it's that little interaction between Moshe and Aaron, you already know it's going to be different. But I think it's before then. I think there's a starting point for all of this. And this is something which Chazal tell us, and that it's the women. It's because of the righteous women that all of this was possible, the redemption was possible. And then you see, instead of brothers not getting along, you have that phenomenal scene where a sister can't turn her back on her brother. And you think back about Mechirat Yosef and how the brothers turn their back on the brother, and here's a sister who can't turn their back on the brother. And I just find that to be so incredibly meaningful. And then along the way, there are these other actions of women in the beginning of Bereshit. But for that matter, when you look at Moshe came from someplace. Moshe came from his mother, and he comes from his sister. Of course, you can say his father and brother as well. But this idea that you don't turn your back on your brother, I think that Moshe internalized that when he goes out to see how his brothers are doing. So I think that act of his sister not turning the back on her brother actually becomes the core of what we find later, both in Moshe and in Aaron's behavior.
So it's the core of a family and family harmony that's absent, because it has to be absent in Bereshit because of all the selection, and some are discarded, some are selected. And that already begins in Vayechi with the gathering of the brothers in a more of a communal, collective setting. So it's a family unit that's healthier. It actually starts a little earlier because you have this description, a nondescript, an anonymous man takes an anonymous woman, and Chazal fill in the blanks. It's a riveting story, because you can just imagine who we know to be Amram, but for whatever reason the Torah describes it as every man, because I think there's a generalization. This is a scene or a situation that many human beings find themselves in, facing horror, facing hardship, facing a world of futility, facing darkness. And Chazal tells us that Amram disassociated with his wife, and he thought it was pointless. Why should he have another child? He already has two children, Aaron and Miriam. Why should he build a larger family when the next child that's born will just be fodder for the crocodiles? And it's actually Miriam, in Chazal's version, who rescues Jewish history. Because if not for Miriam's intercession, Moshe would not have been born. Not for Moshe being born, at least the narrative of redemption that Parsha Shemos, Sefer Shemos provides, doesn't happen. I was thinking about people in the Holocaust, who very soon after the Holocaust would find people from the shtetl or friends of their sisters or nieces and marry and try to rebuild families and name people after those who had been murdered. And you just think about a world in disarray, in a world of absolute horrific darkness. And where were they bringing people? And then 2020 hindsight, those children who were born in 47, 48, they march in the fields of redemption. They're the heroes we celebrate. So sometimes it takes moral energy, but specifically within the family context, we typically associate moral energy with grand, headline-grabbing events rather than just very courageous family construction.
Yeah, precisely at that moment when the prognosis was nil. I mean, I think that's the issue. But just imagine, again, you go back to that anonymous woman, that anonymous mother, or at least for a little bit, that day her son was going to die. and the miraculous that takes place, again, because of the sister, again, Chazal are the ones who added in for the earlier time, but this is in the Chumash, and the one who can't walk away, and she has the gumption to be able to speak to the princess. And at the end of the conversation, somehow she's taking the baby back home. And not only that, but her mother's being paid to do the one thing that she would want to do more than anything else in the world. Meaning, if that's not, as we would say, is chalta de geula, I don't know what is, because you're looking at that darkness. And it's also fascinating that with the birth of Moshe, it's Kitov and Chazal connected to the light which comes into the room. And again, they see that very clearly, that's there. But I just think that that's phenomenal. This micro redemption that took place earlier that morning. She nursed her child and said goodbye and cried and realized that she would never see him again. And then a couple of hours later, she's being paid to nurse him. But what intrigues me is first of all, how long do you think she nursed him? The answer is obvious, as long as she could. What did she say to him when she was nursing him? What messages did she leave him with? What was the educational message she taught?
It's interesting. When you were talking about nursing, and you asked what she said to him, one of my most memorable, I didn't hear this from Rav Lichtenstein, but something he wrote that I'll just never, every time I read it, I get shivers up my spine. Typically we think of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as our father, in the male sense. We not think of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a female, and there's no metaphor for Hashem as a mother. But there's one section in Tanakh, Kegamol alei imo, where David HaMelech says, I'm looking to you like a suckling looks to their mother while they're nursing. And Rav Lichtenstein, in his Shir on Bitachon, wrote about this section. And he talked about how there's a level of bitachon that is not philosophical, it's not conceptual, it's not what will happen, whether it will turn out favorably or disfavorably. It's just feeling the warmth and the protection, the innate, instinctive, the non-spoken warmth. So I'm sure she said things to Moshe, and I'm always jealous of that, because that's an experience I'll never feel. When I watch my wife, and I used to watch my wife, and I watch my children now, it's an amazing notion to feel close to another human being in a way that goes beyond verbal. It's so defenseless and vulnerable. Let me ask you another question while you talk about the women in Parsha Shemot. Obviously the primary women are Miriam and Yocheved. A lot of other women. What about Shifra and Puah? Chazal associate them with Yocheved and Miriam, but the Torah doesn't. What do they give to Moshe? Why are they a Moshe-oriented set of profiles, or they play some other role?
Well, I actually would want to add one more character into this, because the description is that they are Yirei Elokim. The person who we'd previously seen says, I'm Yirei Elokim. Is Yosef, which means Yosef is forgotten, at least by some, or not known by some, but I think he's known by others, which means the imprint or the impact of Yosef on this story, I think, is phenomenal. So that's what I'm saying. The first thought that I have is the words, is that they fear God, and he feared God. And he conducted himself in the palace, which was extremely complicated, on a personal and on a professional level. And he has Paro saying Baruch Hashem after a couple of minutes, which I think is really interesting. But that goes back to what I was trying to get at before, and that is, I think that Moshe's mother said, a long time ago, you had a great uncle called Yosef, and he was a Jew, and he lived in the palace, and he looked out for the rest of his brothers. I think that was the message that she gave it. And then when Moshe leaves Egypt, the fact that he carries out Yosef's remains, on the one hand, you can say that the Levi Yosef, fight is healed at this point, but I think there's a personal debt over there. All the other people are going back to the Brit Ben Abtarim. Okay, where's the money? We need to go borrow money and take it out. And Yosef, Chazal's very clear on that. That Moshe at that point, he's going looking for Yosef's remains, because maybe it was Yosef that kept him going.
So you think the Torah is coding, Vayakam Melech Chadash Asher Lo Yadas Yosef, and then setting the platform for the newer king who will remember Yosef. Yeah. So Moshe has the Yosef complex, which is interesting, because the matters that Yosef enters Eretz Yisrael, Moshe's bar, the famous matters in Veschanan, because Yosef identified so deeply with the land, and Moshe allowed himself to be identified as an Ish Mitzri. So evidently some of that family harmony and family responsibility rubs off on Moshe towards the middle of the parsha, the end of the parsha, where he has a new family. So we don't have that many snapshots of his new family, but to me the snapshot that always was interesting is, I think the Alter of Slobodka talked about this in one of his shmuzin, is HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends Moshe, and he finally convinces Moshe to redeem these suffering people. And every minute there's like a ticker, the McDonald's ticker. How many more babies have been placed into the wall? It's a minute-by-minute massacre. Moshe says, I have to go back and ask Yisro for permission. You have to ask Yisro for permission. Save the day. Yisro will understand. But there's a gentlemanly approach, and there's also a loyalty to family. I can't just disappear for someone that took me into a cell and formed a new family for me.
Yeah, the Rav spoke, and it's been written in his name, some very frightful things, that once Moshe kills the Mitzri, and by the way, that's also fascinating, because you talk about the beginning of Bereshit, where one brother kills a brother because of a lack of a sense of brotherhood. And here Moshe, it says he looks for his brothers and kills the Mitzri because of a sense of brotherhood. So I'm saying that echo of Bereshit in the background is constantly coming back. But the Rav said that Moshe, at that point, when he gets accused the next day of terrible things, who are you? Who placed you as the leader? Which, of course, Chazal hear the words of Datan and later on over there. And Moshe gives up at that point. The Rav actually wrote this. So it's you talk about disappointing. He said, listen, they're not ready. They're just not ready for this. And the question is, how many years go by? And Moshe has this sense, I've been there, done that, I've tried this. Again, he threw away his career, he threw away his life in order to be able to help the people, and they were just not ready to be helped. So this hesitation in Moshe is interesting. See, I think there's a much larger issue, and which is really important for us today and for our children and for our students, that this is the book of redemption. So God wills redemption, redemption takes place. And then we realize that the trajectory of redemption is a very jagged one, and it doesn't go in a direct way that we would want it. If we were writing this, it happens miraculously and immediately. And to realize that we have a reluctant redeemer and we have a redemption process which is slow, and even by the time we get to the book, there's not full redemption, because the redemption going back to the Brit Bein term is entering to the land of Israel, which is just outside of the grasp of Moshe, as you mentioned before.
You talk about the entire Sefer, so I know we're talking about Parshas Shemot, but you mentioned Geula. One of my most poignant memories of Yeshiva was a big fight that erupted in the Chadar Ochel one Friday night between the Israelis and the Americans on Parshas Pekudei. Parshas Pekudei, what can you fight about? It's a pretty straightforward parsha. Rav Ari Kahn, spoke about the Ramban. The Ramban in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, because the nickname of Shemot in Chazal was Sefer Geula, talks about Geula as returning to Malas Avosenu, to the level of our Avos, and that is all achieved in the culmination of the Sefer when we're in the Midbar and we build the Mishkan and we encounter Kadosh Baruch Hu's presence. And Rav Ari Kahn's point, as it always was to create a more complex and nuanced sense of redemption, that ultimately at a historical level, the terminus of history, the terminus of redemption, has everyone returning to this land, not just Jew, but as the Nevi'im tell us, Kol Bnei Adam, everyone comes back to Yerushalayim and sees Kadosh Baruch Hu. But redemption happens in installments. The Rashi, Goel Yisrael, we don't say Goel Yisrael, there are Geulos throughout. It's an ongoing process. Baruch Hashem, Goel Yisrael. And Rav Ari Kahn's point was, you can find redemption to a degree outside of Israel, but I think his major point was that redemption isn't just about land. It's about trying to bring a Kadosh Baruch Hu Shechina into this land. Oh my goodness, you should have heard the screaming going on at that Friday night dinner between the Israelis and the overseas students. So.
I recall a similar issue late at night by night Seder on a Thursday night, a similar discussion which had taken place, mainly because there was one fellow who had studied the Kuzari who said that, who insisted that Har Sinai was in Eretz Yisrael. And then the counter was, well, Moshe never went into Eretz Yisrael. How can you now say that Moshe was there? And this led to getting back to that same point. The Matan Torah was not in Eretz Yisrael. For that matter, Talmud Bavli was not either, which is, I think, part of the same idea. I always imagine that Ramban, who speaks about the level of the forefathers, to actually be the Ohel of Sarah, with the various miracles that Rashi, Chazal tell us existed with the fire and with the dough, which just sounds like a description of the Mishkan itself. That the Mishkan was there trying to recreate that level of the Ohel of Sarah Imenu.
Pasuk in Shir Hashirim, Cheder mi ad shavena melech hadarav. What's beis mi v'cheder harasi? So Chazal, like in the Mishkan, the beis harasi, Cheder mi beis harasi. So maybe Chazal were suggesting something similar. One more woman we didn't talk about, Batya. What's Batya's role? Bas Paro in this whole episode. She's a defiant woman. She defies her culture, defies her father. Yeah. Chazal tell us she was the forerunner of defiance in Am Yisrael. They liken her to Kalev, another rebel.
Yeah, she's very interesting, and she's pronounced later on Bitya. which all of us will call our students and children and so on Batya, but she's called Bitya. And there's another woman, which is Serach Bat Asher, who's beneath the surface. Who we won't talk about her. But I thought that the Bitya story actually sets the stage for something else. When Avraham and Sarah go down into Egypt, which is the microcosm of the Ramban, Chazal, the Tanchuma, of leaving Egypt in terms of the men are threatened, the women are taken, the plagues, leave Baruch Gado with great wealth. And then Hagar HaMitzrit comes with, and she's described by Chazal as being Bat Paro. But she, in this microcosm of the story, ends up failing. And one would wonder, why did they stick a Bat Paro in the story? Because in the macrocosm, there is a Bat Paro as well, who sees the greatness of Moshe, or for that matter, the greatness of God and Torah and Am Yisrael, and says, I want to leave. So I always found that fascinating as well, the contrast between the failed microcosm and the successful macrocosm. And that also tells us something, I think, about Ma'aseh Tzim and Labanim and free will. That just because something is set up doesn't mean it's going to guaranteed happen in the way that we think, and we still have free will to play it out in the way that it needs to be played out.
Wow. So we didn't even talk about the prophetic elements of Shemot. So we talked about family, but Kadosh Baruch Hu chooses to create a world through family and create redemptive potential through family. Only Judaism doesn't shirk from family, something we also learned here very well from our Rabbi. So thank you for being part of our family. Thank you for coming back and sharing some of your wisdom with us, and come back soon.
Thank you.